Hello and welcome to VCSP how-to videos. My name is Peter, and in this video we're going to talk about the Veeam Backup Proxy for VMware. So first of all, what does it do? So the backup proxy is responsible for retrieving the VM data from the production storage. Right, so you can look at it a bit as the working horse that is going to read all the data from the virtual machines, read all the disks from the data store, and send it to the backup repository. Next to that, it is also responsible for compression, deduplication, encryption, and also, if it's not just backup, but in terms of replication, for example, it can also send the data from this source proxy to a target backup proxy. Also important is that by default, the role of the backup proxy is assigned to the backup server itself, which is generally enough for small installations or all-in-one servers with not too much traffic. However, in this case, it means that all the backup traffic will flow through the backup/management server. So for larger installations, it is highly recommended to deploy multiple dedicated backup proxies, because in that case, they will take off the load from the Veeam backup server. They can also be scaled up, they can be scaled out, right? So you can add CPU and memory to an existing proxy to make more backups at the same time. You can also scale out. That way you provide some kind of load balancing, high availability in case one of the proxies is not working. And also you can deploy it on a Windows or a Linux machine. You can choose, right? And we'll get into that as well. So for example, here you can see a setup for backup and replication. So where can this backup proxy be used? So for example, here we can have a customer or a service provider setup that has on the left some production environment, on the right could be also production environment or could be a disaster recovery environment. So we see proxies on the left side and on the right side. So when it comes to backup, then the proxies on the left side, they will read the data from the production storage, compress it, dedupe it, encrypt it if necessary, and store it on the backup repositories in the middle. This can all happen at the same site. When it comes to replication, then the exact same thing happens on the source proxy. However, the data is not sent to the backup repository. The data is sent across some WAN or LAN link to another target proxy, which will then write it to a target VMware infrastructure, right? To a target disaster recovery site, right? So that is the use case of the proxy in this case. Now, we can also use proxies in Cloud Connect. So when it comes to Cloud Connect replication, right? So here we see a setup where the customer could be managed or unmanaged, has their own local environment, and they send virtual machines for disaster recovery purposes to the service provider, who hosts them on either plain vSphere or VCD. So on the left side, we see our source backup proxies at the customer side. So that's one side. And on the right, we have the service provider side, completely different, right? And there we see our target backup proxy servers. Also in the Cloud Connect scenario, the target proxies are not visible for the customer. The customer will just see service provider proxy, but has no clue on whether that's one proxy, multiple proxies, Windows, Linux, whatsoever. They are completely abstracted to the customer. And the service provider on their end, they can use this pool of proxies for one or multiple customers, right? So it's multi-tenant in this way. So next, what is actually installed on the backup proxy, right? What runs there? So there are a few services components that run on the backup proxy. So first of all, the services are very lightweight. They are very fast to deploy, and deployment is actually automated from Veeam Backup and Replication. So when you add a proxy, it will automatically be pushed to that machine. So there's nothing for you to do. You can also choose to manually go and install that. There might be a few cases where you want to do that, but generally it's fully automated. So the two services that run on the backup proxy are the Veeam installer service. The installer service actually analyzes the systems in terms of how much CPU, memory, operating system is running there, and it also installs and upgrades the components, right, depending on their roles that are on this machine. Next, we have the Veeam Data Mover. And the Data Mover, as the name says itself, it performs the data processing tasks. So it's responsible for retrieving the source data, right, performing the deduplication, compressing, and sends the data to the other side, to the target storage, whether that's backup repository or to another proxy. Next, operating system. So these days, the backup proxy can run either on Windows or Linux. We do recommend the latest supported version of Windows Server operating system or supported Linux operating systems for all of the proxies. Note that 64-bit is required. And if you want to know more which exact operating systems and versions are available, then please check our help center because they change over time depending on which version you are running. So you can find the entire list right there. Whether you want to choose virtual or physical, we'll get to that, but both are possible. And depending on the operating system, we don't really see any performance differences, whether it's on Windows or on Linux. Most of the time, the choice is actually made on other design criteria. For example, licensing could be one of them. So in terms of resource requirements, so how much CPU and memory does a backup proxy require? Well, as per user guide, the minimum requirements for CPU are minimum 2 cores and 1 extra core or vCPU for each additional 2 concurrent tasks. Used to be 1, now it's 1 core for each 2 additional concurrent tasks. What's a task? A task is a virtual disk that's being processed. So if you have a virtual machine, it has 2 disks and it can consume 2 tasks. Memory, 2 gigabytes of RAM plus 500 megabytes for each concurrent task. What we see in the field, what is the best practice, is to actually calculate the following. Per concurrent task, so per disk being processed, calculate with 1 physical core or 1 vCPU and add 2 gigabytes of RAM. That makes sizing much easier. Next, physical or virtual. Which one should you choose? Should I deploy 1 or more physical proxies? Or should I go for virtual? Or should I mix? That's an excellent question. And that mainly depends on the production storage that you are backing up from, as well as the target storage that you are writing to in terms of replication. So this will depend, and we will get more into this. It will become more clear once we go through the transport modes. VMware transport modes. As you can see on the right, we have 3 transport modes, right? There is direct storage access, so that's for Fiber Channel, iSCSI, and FS. Virtual appliance, also known as hot hat, and network mode, also known as NBD. So what is actually a transport mode? A transport mode is a method that is used by the Veeam Data Mover service to retrieve the VM data from the source and write the data to the target. And depending on the method chosen, right, depending on the transport mode, the job will run faster or slower or be more efficient, meaning data will be processed over the LAN, over the host, or not, or run over a dedicated network. So depending on what production storage you got and how efficient you want to run your backups, you can choose the appropriate VMware transport mode. So let's dive into each one of them. The first one, direct SAN access. So SAN meaning this is recommended for VMs on a VMFS volume connected over fiber channel over Ethernet, iSCSI, and shared SAS storage. Right? So remember, mainly fiber channel and iSCSI. Here we leverage the VMware VADP. The advantage of this method is that we transfer the VM data directly from the SAN. So we bypass the LAN, we bypass the ESXi. So the proxy talks directly to the production storage. You have to make sure that the proxy can see the LANs, that it has at least read access to the LANs to retrieve all the VM data. This setup generally requires physical proxies, and physical proxies are highly recommended just for performance. Now, if it's a fiber channel, then you don't really have an option. then it's going to be a physical machine. If it's iSCSI, you can choose physical or virtual. This method has also the best performance. But one thing to note is that when you use direct SAN access for restoring, then it can only restore thick VM disks, right? So that's maybe something you don't want. So maybe in that case, you want to use the virtual appliance mode, for example, with a virtual machine, a virtual proxy to restore virtual machines, virtual disks. Next, direct NFS access. Direct NFS access is recommended for VMs on NFS data stores, right? It says so in the name. And it provides an alternative for network mode. So supported are NFS 3 and 4.1, right? In this case, the backup proxy that is used must have access to the NFS data store or data stores. And the data is just as with the direct SAN access, it bypasses the ESXi. It does go over the LAN, just uses TCP IP, but it bypasses the ESXi host, so it gives the best performance in terms of NFS backup. Can be either a virtual machine or a physical machine. In both cases, the backup proxy has a NFS client to read out the data. So that's just going to work. One thing is that the source virtual machine cannot have any snapshots. And also, if the NFS volumes are mounted on the ESXi with the names, right, with the DNS names, not just IP addresses, then you have to make sure that the backup proxy can also resolve them, right? So make sure that DNS is in order. Next, virtual appliance, also known as hotend, which is recommended when physical machines are not an option. You don't like physical machines, or you want to virtualize as much as you can. Or the virtual machines are on local storage within the ESXi, or you're using vSAN or vVols. Then you should use virtual appliance mode. So in this case, we leverage the VMware SCSI hotend capability. So basically, it snapshots the virtual machine. It takes the disk, the VMDK, mounts it to the proxy, and reads out the data directly, bypassing the ESXi. So very good performance. Now, this only works on a virtual machine, right? So it means that you're going to pull your backups through the VMware environment, right? So that might be not that efficient, right? Depending on your setup. It does provide much better performance than the network mode, which we'll discuss next. And what you see in the field is that this is commonly used as a target proxy in terms of replication and as well as for restores. Because if you want to use direct SAN, then you need to make sure that those LANs are accessible for writing to them. And just lots of administrators don't like the fact that something else can write to the LAN, because imagine you initialize this LAN and you format it and everything is gone. So generally, it's used only read to backup fast. But when we restore, you see lots of virtual proxies, because then they just write directly to the data store instead of having to have write access to the SAN, right? So it's more safe. In this case, you also must make sure that this virtual proxy has the latest version of the VMware tools installed. Next, network mode or NBD protocol. In this case, or in this mode, the data is retrieved through the ESXi host over the LAN. This works with any configuration. So out of the box, you can use it. If you don't set up anything, virtual, physical, SAN, NFS, nothing, you just don't configure anything once you've installed Veeam Backup and Replication, this mode is going to work. So it's very easy to set up because there's almost nothing to do. Works with any storage. It's also quick to start the data transfer. You'll see that the job starts pretty fast in backing up. But it's very slow on performance when you're using 1 gigabit Ethernet, for example, because it leverages the ESXi VM kernel interface, the management interface. Now, these days, lots have 10 gigabit and higher, and then it's pretty fast. So make sure that you have at least 10 gigabit or higher when you want to use this method. Works with either physical or virtual, doesn't matter. Overall, it has the lowest performance, and it is also the default failover mode. What this means is that Veeam, when the backup starts, it will check, and it will start with the fastest method. So it will try to see if we can use direct storage access. Fiber channel, iSCSI, NFS. Available, not available? No, not available. Okay, then we'll try Hot. Do we have any virtual machines, any virtual proxies that can access this machine? No, we don't. Then we fail over to network mode because that mode just works. We'll see so also in the demo. In case that you rather have an error message because you want always to back up on direct SAN access or virtual appliance, right? You don't want to switch to network mode, for example. Other than that, it is the default. So here we see a table with all the backup proxy recommendations. And this table comes completely out of the user guide, so you can find it also there when you check. So in this case, you can have a look what production storage type do we have, and then from left to right, the fastest method towards the slowest. So first check if direct storage access is possible. If not, then virtual appliance. If not, network mode, because that will just always work. Before we jump into the demo, here we have a rather high level diagram of all the backup proxy connections, right? All the components that it talks to. So generally we have a backup server, we have proxies, we might have source proxy, we might have target proxy, and on the bottom you can see we have backup repository. So in terms of backup, we see these are the ports that then will be open. There will be some ports from the backup server to the VMware infrastructure, to the proxy, to the repository, but also the proxy needs access to the VMware infrastructure and to the repositories. You'll see that TCP 2500 to 3300 is used quite often. These are also known as the data ports, so that's over which we will transfer all the backed up data between our Veeam components, right? Again, not all of the ports are listed here because it all depends on which components you are using, especially with backup repositories. There's lots of options. So this only lists the most common used ports, right? On the link or in the user guide, if you look for the ports section for backup proxy, that's where you can find all of the other ports. So now let's dive into the demo and have a look at how you can add the backup proxy in Veeam Backup and Replication. So once we open the Veeam Backup and Replication console, we go to Backup Infrastructure and to the top Backup Repositories. Now here we already have a few proxies. We already have a Linux proxy and we have a Windows proxy. So let's just add another proxy for demo purposes. So in my case, I've already added the Windows and Linux machines, right? So normally to add those machines, you just have to click on Add Server, and then you go through the wizard, right? So in case of a Windows or Linux, you put the DNS name or IP address, a description, then you put in the credentials, and then you say Next. Then it will check the connection and it will install the services that we talked about earlier, right? It will deploy the installer service and the transport service. Now, in this case, we've already added them, so it says already exists. So once you hit apply, then it will install them. If this was a new one, in our case, it will just refresh and see that all the packages are already there. So you can see it collected the information, it restarts the service, collects all the information about the machine itself, the hardware info, the disks and the volumes, and then we are done. Next. So here we can see that the machine with this IP address, or in your case if you add it with the DNS name, was successfully added with these options. This is the machine, so it's a virtual machine, it has 2 cores, and these are the components installed and also the ports that these services will be using. So we click Finish. For a Windows proxy, this is exactly the same way. So then we go to Backup Proxies. We click on Add Proxy, or you can also go here on the top menu to Add Proxy. And then we can choose General Purpose Backup Proxy. So as you can see, this is for agent-based backups or NAS filers. And then we have VMware Backup Proxy and we have CDP Proxy. So for us, in this use case, we are going to select the VMware Backup Proxy. So we need to choose a server. So the server that we already added, in my case, the one ending on 62. And this is a Linux proxy. Next up, we have the transfer modes, the connected data stores, and the concurrent tasks, as you can see. So first of all, the transfer modes. We discussed them all in the presentation. By default, it will be on automatic selection. Automatic selection means that Veeam will automatically check which method is available and will pick the best one. So it will always go down from top to bottom. So it will check first for direct storage access, then virtual appliance or network. If you want some method to be always used, you can also select it. So for example, no need to check for SAN because I don't have a SAN, so let's always use network appliance. And this is what I mentioned earlier. You can, by default, it will fail over to network mode if this option is not available, or one of the options if set to automatic. But if you always want this to be used regardless, and you rather receive an error message, then you can disable this checkbox and you will receive an error message if virtual appliance mode is not going to work. Next, connected data stores. So you can manually select which data stores it's supposed to have access to. Normally, you don't change it, it will automatically find them. And then we have the maximum concurrent task. So it will detect how many physical cores or vCPUs you have available. And as you see, it finds 2 CPU cores, so we can use up to 4 tasks. So that's something that was changed recently. Before it was 2 tasks, now it's 4 tasks. So then we click on next. It will validate the server. And optionally, we can also select some network traffic rules if we want. So let's just click on it. So what this means is that if you have a dedicated backup network or storage network that you want to use, so for example, between the proxy and the backup repository or the target proxy, there is a dedicated network for it, then you can specify it here. So you can say, okay, only for backup and replication network, use this dedicated network, and then just click OK. And it will try to use this network always, right? Then we click on next. We will apply the configuration. This will just take a couple of seconds. There we go. It's already created in the database. We click next. It says VMware Backup Proxy was created successfully, and we can finish. So now this one is in the list, and that's it. As you can see, by default, this is the Veeam server itself. It's automatically used as a Windows backup proxy. Now, if you add multiple proxies, then the recommendation is to disable it so that no backup traffic will flow through it, right? You can maybe use it as a restore proxy, but don't use it for any backup proxy. So that's it. Hope this was useful and see you in another video.